This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Don't react. The billionaire signed under the edge of the table, his fingers barely moving. The man beside me has a weapon. The music in the restaurant continued as if nothing in the world had changed. Glasses clinked softly. A jazz piano drifted through the air. Conversations floated between tables like warm evening smoke. And Claire Holloway stood there holding a silver water pitcher, smiling politely, as though the only decision she had to make tonight was between still or sparkling. Anyone watching would have seen a quiet waitress doing her job in one of Manhattan's most expensive dining rooms. No one would have noticed the subtle shift in her eyes. Claire had learned long ago that calm was louder than panic, especially when something was wrong. The restaurant was called Alder and Finch, a place where reservations were booked 3 months out, and a single steak could cost more than a week's groceries for most Americans. Crystal lights reflected off polished walnut walls. Waiters moved like silent choreography between tables of investors, lawyers, and executives who spoke in calm voices about numbers that could reshape entire companies. Claire had been working the evening shift for nearly 6 hours. 8 miles on her pedometer already, and the night wasn't even halfway over. She remembered every order, every allergy note, every impatient guest who thought their watch mattered more than the time of the people serving them. But this table was different. Table 14 had arrived exactly 40 minutes earlier. 5 men in tailored suits. The kind of suits that didn't wrinkle and didn't apologize. The one in the center was Ethan Whitmore. Even if Claire didn't read business headlines, she would have recognized him. There was a particular gravity around certain people, the kind that made entire rooms subtly adjust themselves. Ethan Whitmore was 38 years old and worth more money than most people could imagine counting. Tech acquisitions, global logistics, private equity deals that moved billions like chess pieces. Reporters called him disciplined. Competitors called him ruthless. But tonight, as Claire poured water into his glass, Ethan Whitmore looked like a man calculating something far more immediate than a corporate merger. Claire had noticed it the moment they sat down. His eyes moved constantly, not nervously, but precisely, measuring, observing, the other. Men at the table talked too loudly about projections and market expansion. One of them laughed too easily. Another kept checking his phone. And the man seated to Ethan's right had not touched his food once. Claire noticed things like that. It was a skill most people underestimated in service workers. They assumed waitresses saw plates and tips. In truth, Claire saw patterns. She had grown up in a quiet apartment with a mother who could not hear. Silence had been her first language. Observation had been her second. That was why, when Ethan's fingers shifted slightly beneath the tablecloth, Claire noticed immediately. The motion was small. Too small for anyone unfamiliar with sign language to recognize. But Claire saw it, and understood it. Help me. Her eyes flicked down for less than half a second. Then she continued pouring water as if nothing had happened. Still or sparkling tonight, Mr. Whitmore? She asked in a calm voice. Ethan looked up at her, and for a moment the billionaire who controlled billion-dollar negotiations looked genuinely surprised. Most people didn't look directly at him when they served his table. Claire did. His fingers moved again against the white linen. Slow. Careful. The man beside me has a weapon. Claire did not freeze. Freezing would have been obvious. Instead, she adjusted the position of a fork near his plate, the way a meticulous server might tidy a table setting. Her own fingers moved once across the edge of the napkin. I understand. Ethan Whitmore blinked once. Just once. No one else at the table noticed the silent conversation happening inches from their wine glasses. One of the investors continued explaining something about European infrastructure markets. Another laughed at a joke that hadn't been funny enough to deserve it. The man to Ethan's right remained perfectly still. Claire finally set the water pitcher down and took a small step back from the table. Your entrees will be out shortly, she said politely. Then she added something only Ethan would understand as she picked up a folded menu. Stay calm. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. To anyone watching, he looked relaxed. But his mind was racing. When he had chosen this restaurant for the meeting, he had believed it was the safest room in Manhattan. Private security at the door. Cameras everywhere. A place where no one caused trouble. And yet the moment he had noticed the strange bulge beneath his associate's jacket and the unusual tension in the man's posture, he had known something was wrong. Ethan Whitmore trusted patterns. And tonight the pattern was broken. That was why he had taken the risk of using sign language. It was a skill he rarely used anymore. Not since his younger sister had passed away years ago. He had not expected anyone in the room to understand it. Certainly not the waitress. But Claire Holloway had answered without hesitation. Now she walked toward the kitchen doors as if nothing unusual had occurred. A young busboy passed her carrying a tray of bread baskets. "Claire," he whispered, "Table 9 wants extra butter again." Claire smiled faintly. Of course they do. But her mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. Because the quietest person in the room was usually the one paying attention. And tonight, the only person who had noticed the danger at table 14 was the waitress everyone else thought was invisible. Claire Holloway pushed through the kitchen doors with the same steady pace she used every night. The silver water pitcher still balanced lightly in her hand. And the moment the doors closed behind her, the warm noise of the dining room softened into the quieter rhythm of a professional kitchen, where pans clattered gently and cooks spoke in calm voices that sounded almost like a language of their own. Nothing about Claire's face revealed what had just happened at table 14. She set the pitcher beside the beverage station, wiped a drop of water from the rim, and reached for a clean towel, as if that was the only thing on her mind. Inside, however, every detail from the last 30 seconds replayed with perfect clarity. The sign language had not been dramatic. It had been precise. Ethan Whitmore had moved his fingers slowly, the way someone does when they are making sure a message is understood without drawing attention. Claire knew that style well. It was the language of people who understood silence. Across the kitchen, Marco, the head chef, glanced up from the grill. "Claire, table 12 is asking if the salmon is wild-caught or farm-raised." Claire nodded immediately. "Wild-caught. Alaska shipment came this morning." Marco grinned faintly. "You remember everything." Claire gave a small shrug. Remembering things was easier than explaining them. She grabbed a tray and began lining up 3 appetizer plates, moving with the efficient rhythm of someone who had worked long shifts for years. The tray was only half full when a young server named Lily leaned closer. "You look like you just solved a puzzle," Lily whispered. Claire smiled politely. "Maybe I did." Lily laughed softly, assuming it was a joke, and hurried back toward the dining room. Claire watched her go for a moment. Then she turned slightly and looked through the narrow window built into the kitchen door. Table 14 was still visible from that angle. The men were talking again, leaning toward one another in quiet discussion. Ethan Whitmore sat back in his chair, listening more than speaking. The man on his right remained strangely still. Claire noticed details other people ignored. The way his shoulders stayed tense even while he pretended to relax. The way his eyes moved quickly whenever someone walked past the table. People who were comfortable did not move like that. Claire inhaled slowly and set the tray onto the counter. Her fingers rested on the edge for a second longer than necessary. She had worked in restaurants for nearly 4 years. Long enough to see arguments, broken glasses, and the occasional guest who had too much to drink and too little patience. But tonight was different. Tonight required something else. Calm, precision, timing. She reached for the service bell near the kitchen entrance and tapped it once, lightly. Not enough to call attention. Just enough for the floor manager to glance over. Daniel Mercer had been managing Alder and Finch for nearly a decade. He believed every problem could be solved with politeness and careful observation. Claire walked toward him with the same quiet confidence she always used when delivering a guest request. "Table 14 will need the dessert presentation earlier than scheduled," she said softly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "They have not even finished their entrees yet." Claire's voice remained calm. "It will help the pacing of the evening." Daniel studied her face for half a second. Claire Holloway was not the kind of waitress who made strange suggestions without reason. "All right," he said finally. "I trust you." Claire nodded once and turned away. Trust was useful. She stepped back to the service station and picked up a small leather notepad. Her fingers moved across the surface in a quiet motion that looked like she was reviewing orders. But the motion was not random. It was another message. Across the dining room, Ethan Whitmore noticed immediately. "Stay seated." "Wait." Ethan felt the corner of his mouth tighten slightly. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts in boardrooms across 3 continents. Yet tonight the person directing the situation was a waitress carrying a tray of appetizers. And strangely, he felt more confident because of it. The man beside him finally reached for his glass of water, though he barely took a sip. Ethan noticed the movement. The tension remained. The room continued as if nothing unusual existed within it. A couple near the windows celebrated an anniversary. Two investors at table 9 debated interest rates. The piano player shifted into a slower melody. Claire stepped back into the dining room carrying the tray she had prepared moments earlier. Her posture was relaxed. Her expression was professional. She moved past several tables, greeting guests with the same quiet warmth she always used. But as she approached table 14 again, her attention sharpened. Ethan Whitmore looked up. Their eyes met for less than a second. Then Claire placed the appetizer plates in front of the guests with careful precision. The man beside Ethan shifted slightly in his chair. Claire noticed the movement immediately. She also noticed something else. The restaurant lights above the center aisle flickered once as the staff adjusted the dimmer for evening service. Claire set the final plate down and gently straightened the tablecloth. Her fingers moved once more along the edge of the linen where only Ethan could see. Almost ready. Ethan Whitmore exhaled slowly through his nose. The waitress who had seemed invisible only minutes ago had now quietly taken control of the entire situation. And no one else in the restaurant had any idea. Claire Holloway stepped away from table 14 with the same quiet grace she had practiced through hundreds of dinner shifts, her tray balanced carefully in one hand, while the soft glow of Alder and Finch's chandeliers reflected across the polished floor. And to every guest in the room, she was nothing more than another server moving between tables in a restaurant where money spoke louder than most conversations. But Claire was counting seconds. Timing mattered now. The dessert cart would arrive soon, exactly as she had quietly arranged with Daniel, and when it did, the entire center aisle would shift into motion. Movement created distraction. Distraction created opportunity. Behind her, the conversation at table 14 continued, though Ethan Whitmore had barely said a word during the past 2 minutes. One of the investors across from him was explaining projected returns in a confident voice, tapping the edge of his glass for emphasis, completely unaware that the quiet tension sitting beside Ethan had changed the entire tone of the evening. Ethan listened, nodding occasionally, but his attention remained fixed on the subtle choreography happening across the room. Claire passed table 11, offering a polite smile to a couple celebrating their anniversary. She refilled their wine glasses and wished them a wonderful evening. To anyone watching, she looked perfectly relaxed. Inside, however, every sense remained alert. She noticed the rhythm of the room the way musicians notice tempo. The piano player shifted into a softer melody. A group of executives near the windows leaned closer to hear each other speak. The lighting above the center aisle dimmed slightly as evening service reached its peak. Everything was falling into place. Claire returned briefly to the service station where Lily was polishing silverware. "Dessert cart is ready," Lily whispered. Claire nodded. "Good. Bring it through the main aisle." Lily raised an eyebrow. "Already? That table has not even asked for dessert." Claire gave a faint smile. "Tonight they will." Lily shrugged and began preparing the cart, still unaware that the small change in routine would shift the entire room's attention within minutes. Across the dining room, Ethan Whitmore noticed Claire glance once toward the kitchen doors. The signal was almost invisible, yet Ethan understood immediately. Something was about to happen. He adjusted his posture slightly in his chair, resting one hand near his napkin so that Claire could see it if necessary. The man seated to his right finally spoke after several minutes of silence. "Mr. Whitmore," he said smoothly, "I believe we are close to finalizing the agreement tonight." Ethan turned his head slightly. The man's tone sounded confident. Almost too confident. Ethan had built an empire by recognizing when confidence crossed the line into calculation. "Perhaps," Ethan replied calmly, "though I prefer to review every detail carefully." The man smiled faintly. "Of course." His hand shifted toward the edge of the table as if adjusting his jacket. Claire saw the movement from across the room. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Not yet. Then the dessert cart rolled into the aisle. Lily pushed it carefully, its polished silver frame carrying a tall chocolate souffle, several slices of cheesecake, and a small dessert prepared for dramatic presentation beneath a glass dome. As the cart moved through the center of the restaurant, several guests turned their heads. The warm scent of chocolate drifted into the air. Even the piano player glanced up for a moment. Claire stepped beside the cart just as it reached table 14. "Compliments of the house," she said gently, lifting the glass dome to reveal a plated dessert decorated with a small candle flame dancing softly above the chocolate. The sudden glow drew attention from nearby tables. For a moment, the entire center aisle of the restaurant shifted toward the display. Guests leaned slightly forward. Cameras appeared as someone quietly took a photograph. In that small pocket of distraction, Claire moved the dessert plate onto the table directly in front of Ethan Whitmore. Her fingers brushed the linen beside his hand for less than half a second. Now, Ethan Whitmore leaned forward politely, as if examining the dessert. At the same moment, Daniel Mercer stepped toward the table from the opposite side, his calm voice addressing the group. "Gentlemen, I hope everything has been satisfactory this evening." The unexpected presence of the manager shifted the seating slightly. Chairs adjusted. Attention scattered. In that brief moment of rearranged focus, the tension beside Ethan broke. The man who had remained silent all evening hesitated, his eyes moving quickly between Claire, Daniel, and the sudden movement around the table. Claire stepped back smoothly, her tray already lifted as though her part in the scene had ended. But her eyes remained locked on Ethan Whitmore for just a second longer. Ethan understood immediately. The situation that had felt dangerously tight only minutes earlier had quietly dissolved into confusion and observation. Security staff near the entrance had begun moving closer under Daniel's subtle signal. None of the other guests noticed. The restaurant still hummed with polite conversation and soft music. Claire turned away, guiding the dessert cart toward the next table. Lily leaned closer and whispered with a grin. "Did you see their faces when you lifted that dome? It was like a magic trick." Claire allowed herself the smallest smile. Sometimes timing is everything. Behind her, Ethan Whitmore watched. The waitress disappeared back toward the service station. For the first time in several tense minutes, he felt the room breathe again. And he realized something that surprised him more than the danger itself. The calmest person in the entire building had not been the billionaire at the table. It had been the waitress no one had noticed until tonight. For a few seconds the entire room remained wrapped in the illusion of normalcy, the candle flame on the dessert flickering softly, while the piano continued its gentle melody and guests resumed their conversations as if nothing unusual had interrupted the evening. But Ethan Whitmore knew better. Calm had returned to the room, yet the calm did not feel accidental. It felt engineered. Daniel Mercer stood beside the table with the quiet confidence of a man who had managed difficult situations before. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "I hope the presentation tonight has been satisfactory. The chef prepared something special for this table." One of the investors leaned forward immediately, examining the dessert with a laugh. "Well, that looks impressive." Cameras appeared again. Someone at a nearby table murmured about the chocolate. The moment had become exactly what Claire intended it to be: ordinary distraction. Ethan glanced briefly to his right. The man who had remained silent most of the evening shifted slightly in his chair, his earlier composure replaced by a faint uncertainty. It was a small change, but Ethan noticed it immediately. People who were completely confident rarely reacted to harmless surprises. But this man had reacted. Ethan rested his hands calmly on the table. "It appears your restaurant values dramatic timing," he said lightly to Daniel. Daniel smiled politely. "Our guests deserve memorable evenings." Across the dining room, Claire Holloway guided the dessert cart away from the center aisle. Lily followed behind her, still whispering excitedly about the attention the display had received. "Did you see the couple near the window?" Lily said quietly. "They started clapping when you lifted the dome." Claire gave a small nod. "People like small moments of surprise." Lily laughed softly. "You should do that every night." Claire did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the dining room once more, confirming that two security staff members had quietly repositioned themselves near the main entrance. Daniel had done exactly what she expected. Subtle movement. No alarm. No raised voices. Just quiet awareness spreading through the room like ripples across water. That was the advantage of working somewhere like Alder and Finch. The staff knew how to maintain calm, even when something felt slightly wrong. At table 14, Ethan continued listening to the conversation while observing the room through the reflection in his water glass. The man beside him had stopped speaking entirely. His attention shifted repeatedly toward the front of the restaurant where the security staff now stood in quiet conversation with the hostess. Ethan Whitmore did not need dramatic signals to understand the situation had changed. The pressure that had filled the air earlier was fading. not disappearing completely, but weakening. And all of it had begun with a waitress who had noticed what others had ignored. Ethan finally reached for the dessert fork resting beside the plate Claire had placed in front of him. He examined the chocolate soufflé for a moment before speaking calmly. "Shall we continue our discussion after dessert?" The investors nodded enthusiastically. Businessmen rarely objected to delays when chocolate was involved. The man on Ethan's right forced a polite smile, though his earlier confidence had clearly faded. Ethan noticed the detail, but said nothing. Across the room, Claire returned the dessert cart to the service station and lifted the empty tray from her arm. Marco glanced over from the kitchen pass. "That table looked impressed," he said. Claire wiped a faint ring of water from the tray. "People enjoy a little theater." Marco chuckled. "Well, you delivered it." Claire set the tray aside and reached for a fresh linen napkin. Her hands were steady now, though she remained aware of the dining room beyond the kitchen doors. Timing had worked tonight. But situations like that never ended with a single moment. They ended with quiet follow-through. Lily leaned against the counter beside her. "You ever notice something funny?" Lily asked. Claire raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Lily nodded toward the dining room window where Ethan Whitmore's table remained visible. "The richest man in the room looks like he is the only one actually paying attention." Claire allowed herself the faintest smile. Sometimes the people with the most responsibility learn to watch carefully. Lily shrugged. "I guess so." A moment later, Daniel Mercer entered the kitchen with the composed expression he always carried. He paused beside Claire for a brief second, speaking quietly enough that no one else could hear. "Nice work with the timing," he said. Claire folded the linen slowly. "Just part of the service." Daniel studied her face for a moment before nodding once and stepping back toward the dining room. Claire watched him go. She knew Daniel understood more than he would ever say out loud. That was another skill good managers developed, recognizing when silence solved more problems than questions. Out in the dining room, Ethan Whitmore finally allowed himself to breathe a little easier. The room had returned to its natural rhythm. Guests laughed softly. Glasses clinked again. The piano melody floated across the tables. To anyone entering the restaurant now, the evening would appear perfectly ordinary. Yet Ethan knew something important had happened tonight. Not the kind of event that appeared in headlines. Something quieter. Someone had seen a problem before anyone else. Someone had responded without panic. His eyes drifted across the dining room once more until they found Claire Holloway standing near the service station, speaking calmly with another server. She looked exactly as she had earlier that evening. A waitress finishing her shift, invisible to most people in the room. Ethan Whitmore watched her for a moment longer and realized something unexpected. In a world filled with executives, lawyers, and security professionals, the person he trusted most tonight had been the quiet woman carrying a tray of water glasses. The chocolate soufflé slowly collapsed into itself as the heat escaped from the delicate center, but no one at table 14 seemed particularly concerned about dessert anymore. The conversation had shifted into something quieter now, more cautious, like a group of people who sensed that the evening had taken a subtle turn they could not quite explain. Ethan Whitmore rested his fork beside the plate without taking a bite. He had not lost his appetite because of fear. He had lost it because his mind was busy reconstructing every moment that had happened in the last 15 minutes. The signal, the calm response, the dessert cart, the timing. None of it had been coincidence. Across from him, one of the investors cleared his throat politely. "Mr. Whitmore, regarding the shipping routes we discussed earlier, our analysts believe the expansion could increase annual revenue by at least 12%. Ethan nodded slowly, though his attention drifted toward the reflection in the polished surface of his water glass. From that angle he could see nearly half the dining room without turning his head. Security staff still stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with the hostess. Daniel Mercer remained nearby, occasionally glancing toward table 14 while pretending to review reservations on a small tablet. And Claire Holloway had returned to her routine as if the most unusual part of the evening had never occurred. She refilled glasses at table 10, smiled at a couple near the window, and carried a tray of plates toward the kitchen doors. Invisible again. Ethan Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair. The man seated beside him finally reached for the dessert fork, though his movements had lost their earlier confidence. "Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, "perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more private setting." Ethan looked at him calmly. This restaurant is quite private already. The man hesitated. His eyes flicked briefly toward the entrance where the security staff stood. Then he forced another polite smile. Of course. Across the dining room, Claire placed a stack of clean glasses onto the service station and folded a linen napkin with practiced precision. Lily leaned against the counter beside her, whispering quietly. Table 14 looks tense again. Claire glanced toward the table for less than a second. Business dinners often do. Lily laughed softly. If that is business, I am glad I serve food instead of negotiating. Claire smiled faintly, but said nothing. She knew the tension Lily noticed was not about contracts anymore. It was about awareness. And awareness changed the atmosphere of a room faster than raised voices ever could. Daniel Mercer stepped beside Claire again, speaking quietly as he arranged a stack of menus. Security confirmed everything is under control, he said. Claire nodded once. Good. Daniel paused before adding something else. You noticed before anyone else. Claire continued folding the napkin. Sometimes people show you who they are if you watch long enough. Daniel studied her expression briefly, then gave a quiet nod and walked back toward the dining room. Claire inhaled slowly and picked up another tray. The shift was not over yet. Work rarely paused simply because something unusual had happened. She moved toward the kitchen doors again, passing beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers that made Alder and Finch look more like a theater stage than a restaurant. Guests continued laughing. Wine continued pouring. The room had returned to its elegant rhythm. At table 14, Ethan Whitmore finally lifted the fork and broke a small piece from the edge of the soufflé. The chocolate was warm and rich, but he barely noticed the taste. Instead, he spoke calmly to the group around him. Gentlemen, I believe we should conclude the evening here. My office will contact each of you tomorrow regarding the final terms. The investors exchanged quick glances, but nodded. None of them seemed eager to argue. The man beside Ethan hesitated again before setting down his fork. Very well. Ethan reached for his glass of water and took a slow sip. Then he placed the glass back onto the table with quiet precision. However, he added, before we leave, I would like to thank the staff for their exceptional service tonight. His voice was calm, but the sentence carried a meaning only one person in the room would fully understand. Claire Holloway emerged from the kitchen carrying another tray of plates just in time to hear the remark. She glanced briefly toward the table. Ethan Whitmore was already standing. The other guests followed his lead, pushing back their chairs. The dinner meeting was ending earlier than anyone expected. Lily whispered beside the service station. Wow, that was fast. Those guys did not even finish dessert. Claire set the tray onto the counter and picked up a fresh water pitcher. Sometimes people realize they have had enough for one evening. Lily shrugged. I guess so. Claire walked back toward the dining room once more. As she approached table 14, Ethan Whitmore was buttoning his jacket. The other men were gathering their coats. The quiet man who had sat beside him all evening avoided eye contact as he stepped away from the table. The moment passed quickly, almost unnoticed by the surrounding guests. Yet the tension that had filled the air earlier was gone completely now. Ethan Whitmore turned toward Claire as she reached the table with the water pitcher. For a brief moment, the billionaire and the waitress stood facing each other beneath the warm restaurant lights. He did not speak immediately. Instead, his hand moved once beside the edge of the tablecloth where no one else could see. Thank you. Claire's eyes softened just slightly. Her fingers adjusted the napkin beside his empty dessert plate. You are welcome. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. Then Ethan Whitmore picked up his coat and walked toward the exit with the quiet confidence of a man who had just realized something important. And behind him, Claire Holloway returned to clearing the table as if the entire evening had been nothing more than another shift at work. The front doors of Alder and Finch opened quietly as Ethan Whitmore stepped out into the cool Manhattan night, the soft glow of the restaurant lights fading behind him while the city continued its restless rhythm of traffic, distant sirens, and the quiet hum of people moving through their evening routines. A black sedan waited at the curb, its driver standing beside the rear door with the calm patience of someone accustomed to long nights and powerful passengers. Ethan paused before entering the car. His mind was not on the meeting that had just ended. It was not on the contracts waiting on his desk tomorrow morning or the conference call scheduled at 7:30 sharp. Instead, his thoughts returned again and again to the same unexpected image. A waitress holding a water pitcher. Calm eyes. hands that spoke a language no one else in the room understood. The driver cleared his throat politely. "Office, sir." Ethan looked up briefly, as though the question had traveled a long distance to reach him. "No," he said finally. "Home." The driver nodded and opened the rear door. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, Ethan leaned back against the leather seat and watched the restaurant grow smaller through the tinted glass. In 38 years, he had learned to measure people quickly. Investors, executives, lawyers, competitors. His instincts had built an empire because he rarely misjudged character. Yet tonight someone had surprised him completely. Inside the restaurant, Claire Holloway finished clearing the last dishes from table 14. The tablecloth was smooth again. The dessert plate had been removed. Glasses were stacked neatly onto her tray. Anyone walking past would have assumed the evening at that table had been ordinary. Lily approached beside her carrying a stack of folded napkins. "Those guys left a huge tip," Lily whispered with a grin. Claire glanced at the receipt briefly. The number printed at the bottom was larger than most tables left in an entire night. Lily leaned closer. "I think that tall one in the gray suit liked you." Claire gave a small amused smile. "He was polite." Lily shook her head. "Polite does not leave tips like that." Claire folded the receipt into the bill holder and placed it onto the tray. "Some people appreciate good service." Lily laughed softly and walked toward another table, already distracted by a guest calling for more wine. Claire carried the tray back toward the service station where Daniel Mercer stood reviewing the evening's reservations. He glanced at the receipt and let out a low whistle. "That man believes in gratitude." Claire shrugged lightly as she stacked the glasses. It was a complicated dinner. Daniel studied her expression carefully. "You handled it well." Claire reached for a fresh cloth and wiped the polished surface of the counter. "I only did my job." Daniel leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Most people would not have noticed what you noticed." Claire paused for a moment before answering. "Most people are busy watching themselves." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding more than the words revealed. Across town, Ethan Whitmore's sedan moved smoothly through late evening traffic. Streetlights reflected across the windshield like a long chain of golden beads stretching into the distance. Ethan tapped his finger lightly against the armrest as he replayed the evening in his mind once more. The signal had been subtle. The response had been immediate. Claire Holloway had understood sign language without hesitation. That alone would have been unusual enough. But the real surprise had been something else. She had not reacted with fear. She had not looked impressed by his name or intimidated by the situation. She had simply solved the problem. Calmly, quietly, precisely. The car slowed at a red light near Central Park. Ethan glanced out the window at a couple walking their dog beneath the streetlights. Ordinary people finishing an ordinary evening. For the first time that night, he wondered something he had not considered earlier. Who was Claire Holloway when she was not carrying a tray of glasses? Back at Alder and Finch, the dinner rush had begun to fade. Several tables were already empty. The piano player switched to a softer melody while the remaining guests lingered over coffee. Claire carried a pitcher of water toward a table near the windows when Lily suddenly called from across the room. "Claire, phone call for you at the host stand." Claire blinked in mild surprise. "For me?" Lily shrugged. "The hostess said someone asked for you by name." Claire walked toward the entrance where the hostess stood beside the small desk, holding the restaurant phone. "Line 2. The hostess said quietly. Claire lifted the receiver and placed it gently against her ear. "This is Claire." For a moment, there was only silence on the line. Then a familiar voice spoke calmly. "Good evening, Claire Holloway." Ethan Whitmore sat in the back of the sedan, holding his phone with the composed expression of a man who rarely made calls without purpose. Claire recognized the voice immediately. Her eyes moved instinctively toward the restaurant doors as if expecting him to be standing there. "Mr. Whitmore," she said politely. Ethan allowed the faintest smile to appear. "I realized I left something unfinished tonight." Claire waited quietly. "I thank you," Ethan continued, "but I did not actually ask the question that matters." Claire leaned lightly against the host stand, curious despite herself. "And what question is that?" Ethan Whitmore glanced out at the quiet New York street beyond the window of his car before answering slowly. "How did a waitress in Manhattan learn to read sign language faster than my entire security team?" Claire did not answer immediately. The corner of her mouth lifted in a small, thoughtful smile. Because sometimes the most interesting conversations do not begin until after the danger has already passed. Claire Holloway did not answer Ethan Whitmore's question immediately. The quiet hum of the restaurant surrounded her as she held the receiver to her ear, the faint clinking of glasses and soft piano music filling the air behind her. A couple near the window laughed over coffee. The hostess flipped through the reservation book. Everything in the room looked ordinary, yet Claire knew the conversation on the phone was not. She leaned slightly against the host's stand and spoke calmly. Most people learn languages because they are curious, she said. I learned because it was the only way to talk to my mother. On the other end of the line, Ethan Whitmore remained silent for a moment. The sedan continued gliding through the quiet Manhattan streets while the city lights reflected across the dark glass. That answer had not been rehearsed. It had been simple, honest. Ethan finally spoke again. Your mother is deaf. Claire nodded, even though he could not see her. Completely. Ethan leaned back slightly in the leather seat. Something about that detail shifted his understanding of the evening. That explains the speed, he said quietly. Claire allowed herself a small smile. When sign language is the first language you learn, it becomes instinct. The hostess nearby glanced at Claire curiously, clearly wondering who she was speaking to, but Claire simply turned slightly away and continued the conversation. Ethan tapped one finger against the phone. You did not hesitate tonight, he said. Most people would have panicked. Claire considered the question for a moment before answering. When you grow up communicating without sound, you learn something interesting. Ethan waited. Claire continued softly. Silence forces you to watch everything. The car slowed again at another intersection, the red glow of a traffic light washing briefly across the interior. Ethan understood exactly what she meant. Observation had saved him tonight, but it had been her observation that mattered most. You read the room faster than my security team, Ethan said. Claire gave a quiet breath of amusement. Your security team probably expected trouble from outside the restaurant. Ethan smiled faintly. And you expected it from the table. From the body language, Claire corrected gently. Ethan paused again. The waitress who had seemed invisible earlier in the evening had just described something many trained professionals failed to master. Human behavior. Claire, Ethan said after a moment. How long have you worked there? Claire glanced around the dining room. Several tables were already empty as the evening slowed. Lily was polishing glasses near the bar. Daniel Mercer stood near the entrance reviewing the last reservations of the night. 3 years, she answered. That is a long time to stay in one restaurant, Ethan observed. Claire laughed quietly. You say that like restaurants are temporary places. Ethan considered the comment. For him, they usually were. Meetings, deals, short visits. Then he moved on to the next city. But for Claire Holloway, the restaurant was clearly more than a temporary stop. Do you like it there? He asked. Claire looked across the dining room, where the chandeliers cast warm reflections on the floor. It is honest work, she said. And I meet interesting people. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, even though she could not see it. Including billionaires who accidentally signal for help in sign language. Claire smiled again. Especially them. The driver glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, curious about the faint tone of humor in Ethan Whitmore's voice. It was rare for the billionaire to sound relaxed during business calls. Ethan looked out at the city lights once more before speaking again. I owe you more than a thank you, he said. Claire shook her head slightly, even though the gesture would never travel through the phone line. You owe me nothing, she replied. You handled the situation calmly, Ethan insisted. Claire's voice remained steady. Mr. Whitmore, if you tip every waitress who refills your water glass, you will run out of money eventually. Ethan laughed quietly. The driver nearly glanced back again in surprise. Ethan Whitmore rarely laughed on business calls. You are the first person who has ever warned me about running out of money, Ethan said. Most people spend their time asking for it. Claire folded her free hand over the edge of the host's stand as she thought about that sentence. She had served many wealthy guests over the years. Some were generous. Some were impatient. Some barely noticed the people around them. But Ethan Whitmore had done something different tonight. He had trusted her instantly when she answered his signal. I was not helping a billionaire, Claire said gently. I was helping a person who asked for help. Ethan went quiet again. The car turned onto Park Avenue, its long rows of lights stretching into the distance. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts with perfect composure, Ethan Whitmore found himself unexpectedly thoughtful. Claire's voice had not changed once during the conversation. Calm, honest, direct. He realized something then that made him speak again before the call could end. Claire, he said. Yes. Would you consider meeting me for coffee tomorrow? Claire blinked in surprise. The question had arrived so naturally, it almost sounded casual. Yet she knew the man asking it was anything but casual. Lily glanced over curiously as Claire hesitated. Ethan continued calmly. Not as a customer, he added. As someone who would like to understand the woman who solved a problem my entire team did not see. Claire looked out through the glass doors of the restaurant toward the quiet street beyond. For the first time that evening, she found herself unsure how to respond immediately. Which was interesting, because Claire Holloway was rarely unsure of anything. Claire Holloway did not answer Ethan Whitmore immediately. The soft piano music inside Alder and Finch drifted through the dining room while the last few guests lingered over dessert and coffee, unaware that a quiet moment at the host's stand had suddenly become far more complicated than the rest of the evening combined. Claire looked through the tall glass doors toward the quiet Manhattan street outside, where yellow streetlights reflected off the pavement like small pools of gold. She had expected the conversation to end with gratitude. A polite thank you. Perhaps another generous tip. She had not expected a billionaire to ask her to coffee, as though they were simply two strangers who had met under unusual circumstances. On the other end of the line, Ethan Whitmore waited without speaking. He had learned long ago that silence often encouraged honesty. Negotiators filled silence with information. Investors filled silence with numbers. Tonight he was curious what Claire Holloway would fill it with. Behind Claire, Lily finished polishing the last row of glasses and leaned closer with curiosity written across her face. Claire lifted one finger slightly to signal that she was still on the phone. Lily nodded and quietly retreated toward the bar area, though she continued watching with interest. Finally Claire spoke. You realize, she said gently, that most people would assume you are asking me out because you feel grateful. Ethan leaned slightly forward in his seat as the sedan continued down Park Avenue. Do you assume that? Claire considered the question carefully. No, she said after a moment. You do not sound like someone who does things because he feels obligated. Ethan smiled faintly at that observation. Then why the hesitation? Claire exhaled softly. Because my shift ends in 20 minutes, and tomorrow morning I am supposed to sleep. Ethan let out a quiet laugh. That sounds like a scheduling problem, not a philosophical one. Claire glanced back into the dining room, where Daniel Mercer was now dimming the lights near the back section of the restaurant. The evening was clearly winding down. She returned her attention to the phone. Where would this coffee take place? She asked. Ethan looked out the window again as the car slowed near a row of quiet brownstone buildings. There is a small cafe on Lexington Avenue, he said. 6 blocks from your restaurant. Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. You already know where I work. You told me. Ethan replied calmly. Claire allowed herself a small amused smile. I suppose I did. Ethan continued in the same steady tone. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Claire laughed softly. That is exactly when I will be asleep. Ethan paused for a moment before adjusting the plan. 10 o'clock. Claire thought about the suggestion. The shift would end soon. She would walk the familiar 6 blocks to her apartment. Sleep for a few hours. Wake up again. Meet a billionaire for coffee as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The idea was strange enough to make her smile. 10 o'clock, she repeated slowly. Ethan sensed the hesitation fading. Is that a yes? Claire looked once more toward the quiet street beyond the restaurant doors. Her life had always followed a simple rhythm. Work, home, occasional quiet evenings with her mother across town. She had never planned on adding unexpected meetings with powerful strangers into that routine. But tonight had already proven that unexpected things sometimes arrived without warning. All right, she said finally. 10 o'clock. Ethan leaned back slightly in the seat, satisfied by the answer though he kept his voice calm. Good. Claire tilted her head slightly. You sound like a man who usually gets his way. Ethan smiled faintly. I sound like a man who knows when he has been helped by someone remarkable. Claire felt a brief warmth in her chest that surprised her more than the invitation itself. Compliments from guests were common in restaurants. Yet this one sounded different. It sounded sincere. Lily returned quietly to the host's stand and whispered, Your mystery caller sounds important. Claire covered the phone with her hand for a second. I will explain later. Lily's eyes widened with playful excitement before she slipped away again. Ethan heard the faint whisper through the receiver and asked curiously, "Busy restaurant?" Claire nodded, even though he could not see her. "The last guests are finishing dessert." Ethan glanced out the window once more. The sedan slowed as it approached his building entrance. "Then I should let you finish your evening," he said. Claire leaned slightly against the host's stand. "Mr. Whitmore." Ethan paused before ending the call. "Yes." Claire spoke gently. "Tomorrow morning you are not meeting a waitress who saved your dinner meeting." Ethan listened carefully. "Who am I meeting?" Claire's voice carried the faintest trace of humor. "Just a woman who grew up speaking with her hands." Ethan Whitmore smiled quietly as the car came to a stop beneath the lights of his building entrance. "I look forward to meeting her." Claire hung up the phone slowly and placed the receiver back onto the stand. For a moment, she simply stood there watching the quiet street outside. Lily appeared again almost instantly. "Okay," Lily whispered excitedly. "You have to tell me everything." Claire laughed softly as she picked up a tray from the counter. "Tomorrow," she said. Lily frowned. "Why tomorrow?" Claire smiled and walked back toward the dining room where the last few tables were finishing their coffee. "Because tomorrow morning," she said quietly, "I am having coffee with a billionaire." Morning arrived slowly over Manhattan, the pale sunlight slipping between tall buildings and stretching across Lexington Avenue as the city began its familiar rhythm of taxis, coffee cups, and hurried footsteps. Claire Holloway stepped out of her small apartment building just after 9:45, adjusting the light gray coat she had pulled over a simple blue sweater. The cool air carried the smell of roasted coffee from the corner cafe 2 blocks away. And for a moment she paused on the sidewalk as if deciding whether this morning was real or simply the strange continuation of a very long shift. She had slept for barely 5 hours, yet she did not feel tired. Something about the unusual invitation had replaced exhaustion with curiosity. Claire began walking toward the cafe at an easy pace, her hands tucked into her coat pockets as she moved through the familiar neighborhood. People passed her carrying paper cups and briefcases. A delivery truck idled beside the curb. Somewhere down the street, a street musician tuned a guitar. Everything felt ordinary again, which made the memory of last night feel almost surreal. A billionaire whispering through sign language beneath a restaurant table. A silent warning. A carefully timed distraction. And now coffee. Claire smiled faintly as she reached the corner and turned toward the cafe Ethan had mentioned. The place was small and warm, the kind of neighborhood spot where baristas remembered regular customers and sunlight spilled across wooden tables near the windows. Inside, Ethan Whitmore was already seated. He sat at a corner table with a black coffee in front of him, dressed in a dark navy coat instead of the formal suit he had worn the night before. Without the atmosphere of a luxury restaurant surrounding him, he looked almost like any other early morning professional beginning the day. Almost. Claire stepped inside and paused briefly near the entrance as Ethan looked up. Their eyes met across the small room, and for a moment both of them seemed to recognize the quiet oddness of the situation. A waitress from a Manhattan restaurant and one of the most powerful businessmen in the city sitting down for coffee as though they had arranged it weeks ago. Ethan stood politely as Claire approached the table. "Good morning, Claire." Claire slid into the chair across from him. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "If we are meeting for coffee, I believe you can call me Ethan." Claire smiled. Old habits from work. A barista approached with a friendly nod. "What can I get you?" Claire ordered a simple latte, and within a minute the warm cup rested in front of her. The quiet hum of the cafe surrounded them as people typed on laptops and read newspapers at nearby tables. Ethan watched Claire for a moment before speaking. "You look less like a waitress this morning." Claire took a sip of her coffee and shrugged lightly. "And you look less like a billionaire." Ethan chuckled softly. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me this week." Claire leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him with the same calm attention she had shown the night before. Without the formal environment of Alder and Finch, Ethan Whitmore seemed almost relaxed. Yet the same careful awareness still lingered in his eyes. "So," Claire said after a moment, "what exactly did you want to understand?" Ethan rested his hands around the warm coffee cup as he answered honestly. "You." Claire tilted her head slightly. "That is a very broad topic." Ethan nodded. "It is also the only one that interested me after last night." Claire considered that statement while the morning light drifted across the table between them. You seem like someone who prefers predictable situations, she said. Most billionaires do. Ethan smiled faintly. And you seem like someone who notices the unpredictable ones. Claire laughed softly. That is because unpredictable situations are usually the ones that matter. Ethan nodded slowly. Exactly. For a moment, they simply sat there listening to the quiet background sounds of the cafe. A milk steamer hissed behind the counter. Someone laughed near the window. Outside, the city continued its constant motion. Finally, Ethan spoke again. I have a question I did not ask last night. Claire raised an eyebrow. Another one? Yes. Claire folded her hands around her coffee cup. All right. Ethan looked directly at her. Why are you still working as a waitress? Claire blinked slightly at the directness of the question, though her expression remained calm. That is a dangerous question to ask someone you just met. Ethan smiled. I assumed you would say something like that. Claire leaned back again, considering how to answer. Let me ask you something first, she said. Ethan nodded. Go ahead. Claire met his eyes with quiet curiosity. Why would a billionaire care about the career choices of a waitress he met less than 12 hours ago? Ethan Whitmore held her gaze for a long moment before answering slowly. Because I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who pretend to notice everything, he said. And last night you were the only person in the room who actually did. Claire looked down at her coffee for a second before smiling softly. And for the first time that morning, she realized that the conversation they had started might be far more interesting than either of them expected. Claire Holloway held Ethan Whitmore's gaze across the small cafe table for a few quiet seconds after his answer. The morning sunlight reflecting softly on the surface of her coffee cup, while the steady rhythm of the city continued outside the window. She had heard many kinds of compliments during years of serving tables in Manhattan. Some were polite. Some were careless. Some were designed to impress. But Ethan's words sounded different. He had not said them to flatter her. He had said them like a man explaining a fact he had finally noticed. Claire took another small sip of her latte before responding. That sounds like a very lonely way to live, she said gently. Ethan raised one eyebrow. Running companies? Claire shook her head slightly. Being surrounded by people who pretend to notice things. Ethan leaned back in his chair, considering the comment with quiet honesty. The cafe around them had begun to fill with late-morning customers, laptops opening across wooden tables, while baristas moved quickly behind the counter. Yet, somehow the small corner table where they sat felt separate from the rest of the room. It is not always lonely, Ethan said finally. But it is predictable. Claire nodded slowly. Predictable people are easier to manage. Ethan gave a small smile. You sound like someone who has studied human behavior. Claire rested her hands around the warm coffee cup. When you grow up communicating with someone who cannot hear, you learn to watch faces, posture, breathing. Everything becomes information. Ethan remembered the moment the night before when her fingers had answered his signal without hesitation. Your mother taught you that. Claire nodded. She taught me patience first. Observation came after. Ethan looked down at the dark surface of his coffee for a moment before speaking again. I had a sister who was deaf. Claire's eyes lifted with quiet interest. Ethan continued slowly, choosing his words carefully. She lost her hearing when she was 7. I learned sign language so we could still argue about things. Claire smiled faintly at that image. Did you win the arguments? Ethan shook his head. Rarely. The warmth in his voice suggested those memories were important ones. Claire watched him for a moment before speaking again. That explains why you used sign language at the restaurant. Ethan nodded. It was instinct. I saw a possible problem and needed a way to communicate without drawing attention. Claire tilted her head slightly. And you expected no one to understand. Ethan looked up at her again. Correct. Claire gave a small, amused shrug. That must have been disappointing. Ethan laughed quietly. On the contrary, it may have been the most useful surprise of my week. Outside the cafe window, a yellow taxi rolled past, while pedestrians hurried along the sidewalk with paper bags and morning newspapers. Claire rested her elbow lightly against the table and studied Ethan's expression with the same calm focus she used when watching a crowded dining room. You still did not answer my question, she said. Ethan looked puzzled for a moment. Which question? Claire smiled softly. Why you care what a waitress chooses to do with her life? Ethan did not hesitate this time. Because you are clearly capable of much more than carrying trays. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair. That depends on what you believe carrying trays means. Ethan raised an eyebrow again. I believe it means working very hard for very little recognition. Claire laughed softly. That is one interpretation. Ethan waited. Claire continued calmly. Another interpretation is that it means being in a place where people reveal who they really are. Ethan nodded slowly. Restaurants are interesting places for observation. Claire gestured lightly toward the busy cafe around them. Every table is a story. Ethan glanced briefly at the people around them. A student studying for exams. A businessman reviewing documents. A young couple sharing a pastry. You watch all of that, he asked. Claire smiled. Every shift. Ethan leaned forward slightly. And what have you learned? Claire met his eyes with quiet clarity. That power is not the most interesting thing about people. Ethan considered the answer carefully. Then what is? Claire took one final sip of her latte before answering. How they behave when no one important is watching. Ethan Whitmore held her gaze for several seconds after that sentence, realizing something he had not expected when he woke up that morning. He had come to the cafe curious about a waitress who had solved a problem the night before. But now he was sitting across from a woman who seemed to understand people better than most executives he had hired in his entire career. Ethan finally smiled again. Claire, he said slowly, you may be the most observant person I have ever met. Claire tilted her head playfully. That is a very polite way of saying I watch people too much. Ethan shook his head. No, it is a way of saying you notice things others ignore. Claire looked out the cafe window once more as sunlight filled the street. Sometimes noticing things leads to trouble. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Sometimes it leads to opportunity. Claire turned back toward him with quiet curiosity. Opportunity for what? Ethan Whitmore's expression remained calm, but the idea forming in his mind was anything but casual. Because for the first time since their conversation began, he was starting to wonder whether the woman sitting across from him might belong somewhere far beyond a restaurant dining room. Claire Holloway watched Ethan Whitmore carefully after his last sentence, the faint hum of the cafe filling the silence between them while sunlight continued drifting across the wooden table. She had heard the tone in his voice before, not in restaurants, but in the occasional conversation between ambitious guests discussing ideas larger than the rooms they were sitting in. That tone carried curiosity mixed with calculation. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her hands around the empty coffee cup. Opportunity is an interesting word, she said calmly. Ethan nodded once. It usually is. Claire studied him for a moment longer before continuing. When people say that word to a waitress, it normally means one of two things. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. I am curious what those two things are. Claire smiled faintly. Either they are about to offer advice I did not ask for, or they are about to offer a job that would make them feel generous. Ethan laughed softly at that, the sound surprising even himself. You are very direct. Claire shrugged lightly. Direct conversations save time. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. Then let me be direct as well. Claire waited. Ethan continued. Last night you read a situation faster than people whose entire profession is observation and security. This morning you explained human behavior in a way most corporate analysts would struggle to describe. Claire tilted her head slightly. You make that sound like a resume. Ethan gave a small smile. In a way it is. Claire looked around the cafe briefly before returning her attention to him. The morning crowd had grown busier now. A barista called out someone's name for a pickup order. A group of students near the window were laughing over a shared laptop. Yet the conversation at their table seemed strangely insulated from the noise. Ethan, Claire said slowly, testing the name again now that they had agreed to use first names. You still have not told me what kind of opportunity you are imagining. Ethan tapped his fingers lightly against the side of the coffee cup before answering. I run companies that depend on understanding people, he said. Investors, partners, negotiators, competitors. Claire nodded slightly. That sounds exhausting. Ethan smiled faintly. It can be. Claire continued watching him closely, the same quiet, analytical expression she had used in the restaurant. And you believe I would be useful in that environment? Ethan did not hesitate. Yes. Claire leaned back again, considering his answer carefully. For a moment neither of them spoke. The idea hung quietly in the air between them like a possibility neither had fully explored yet. Finally Claire spoke again. You realize I never finished college. Ethan shrugged lightly. Neither did several of the most successful entrepreneurs I know. Claire continued calmly. I do not have experience in corporate strategy. Ethan responded just as calmly. You have experience reading people. Claire smiled slightly. You are very persistent. Ethan nodded. That is one of the reasons my companies exist. Claire rested her chin lightly against her hand for a moment while thinking. She had spent years building a stable life around simple routines. Work, family visits, quiet evenings. The suggestion Ethan had just made would shift that entire rhythm in ways she had never planned. Let me ask you something, she said finally. Ethan gestured for her to continue. Claire looked directly at him. Do you normally recruit employees in coffee shops the morning after meeting them? Ethan laughed quietly again. No, Claire raised an eyebrow. Then why today? Ethan's expression softened slightly, though the confidence in his voice remained steady. Because last night reminded me of something I have been forgetting. Claire waited. Ethan continued slowly. The most valuable people in the room are not always the ones sitting at the table. Claire looked down at her empty coffee cup for a moment, then back up at him. And you believe I am one of those people? Ethan nodded. I do. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the cafe window where the late morning sun now illuminated the busy sidewalk. People walked past with grocery bags and coffee cups, living their ordinary Tuesday routines without realizing that a waitress and a billionaire were quietly discussing a future neither of them had planned. Claire finally spoke again, her voice calm but thoughtful. You may be right about one thing. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Which thing? Claire smiled faintly. The most valuable people in a room are not always the ones at the table. Ethan nodded slowly. Exactly, Claire continued, her tone still gentle, but now carrying a hint of playful curiosity. But sometimes those people prefer where they are. Ethan held her gaze for several seconds, realizing that Claire Holloway was not impressed by titles, money, or dramatic opportunities. She was weighing the idea the same way she had evaluated the situation in the restaurant the night before. Carefully, quietly, intelligently, and for reasons he could not entirely explain yet. Ethan Whitmore found that far more interesting than any resume he had ever reviewed. Claire Holloway did not rush to answer Ethan Whitmore after her last sentence. The quiet confidence in her voice still lingered in the air between them while the cafe continued its steady morning rhythm. Someone opened the door, and a brief wave of cool air slipped inside. A barista called out another order. Outside the window, a cyclist passed through the intersection while a taxi slowed for pedestrians crossing the street. Everything about the city felt ordinary, yet the conversation at their table had slowly shifted into something neither of them had expected when the morning began. Claire rested her fingers lightly on the edge of the table and looked at Ethan with calm curiosity. You are used to people saying yes very quickly, she said. Ethan considered that statement and nodded once. Usually. Claire smiled faintly. I imagine that is because your opportunities come with impressive numbers attached to them. Ethan let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like amusement. Sometimes they do. Claire tilted her head slightly. And sometimes they come with pressure. Ethan did not deny it. That is also true. Claire studied his expression for a moment longer before continuing. You asked why I am still working as a waitress. Ethan nodded again, remembering the question that had started this entire turn in the conversation. Claire looked down briefly at the empty cup in front of her before speaking again. 3 years ago, my mother had surgery that required months of rehabilitation, she explained calmly. The restaurant schedule allowed me to help take care of her. Ethan listened carefully without interrupting. Claire continued. Before that, I was studying communication sciences at a university in Queens. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You left school. Claire nodded. Temporarily at first. She gave a small, thoughtful smile. Life sometimes changes temporary decisions into longer ones. Ethan understood that kind of change. The difference was that his own life had always provided resources to redirect those decisions. Claire had clearly navigated hers differently. How is your mother now? He asked quietly. Claire's expression softened. Much better. Ethan nodded slowly, processing the information. For a moment he said nothing. The offer he had imagined earlier suddenly seemed less like an exciting idea and more like a serious interruption to the life Claire had carefully built around responsibility. Claire noticed the shift in his expression immediately. You look like a man reconsidering something, she said gently. Ethan allowed a small smile to return. I am reconsidering the speed at which I suggested opportunity. Claire laughed softly. That is the most diplomatic sentence I have heard this week. Ethan rested his hands together on the table. You deserve the time to decide what you want, not what someone else believes you should want. Claire watched him for a moment, surprised by the sincerity in that statement. Many powerful people were accustomed to moving others around like pieces on a board. Ethan Whitmore, however, seemed to be doing something different. He was stepping back. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her arms comfortably. You know something interesting, she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What is that? Claire smiled faintly. You are the first billionaire I have met who offered a life-changing opportunity and then immediately gave the person permission to say no. Ethan chuckled quietly. Perhaps that means I am learning something. Claire looked at him thoughtfully. What are you learning? Ethan answered honestly. That intelligence is not always located where my industry expects to find it. Claire glanced around the cafe again, noticing the mix of students, office workers, and neighborhood regulars moving through their routines. Intelligence is everywhere, she said softly. Most people just stop looking once they believe they have already found it. Ethan nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in that observation. For several seconds they both sat quietly, allowing the conversation to settle naturally instead of forcing it forward. Finally Claire spoke again. If I ever decided to return to school or explore a different career path, I would want that choice to come from curiosity, not pressure. Ethan met her eyes. That sounds reasonable. Claire smiled slightly. In the meantime, I am still a waitress who enjoys watching people. Ethan leaned back and allowed himself a relaxed breath for the first time that morning. And I am still a businessman who occasionally needs someone observant nearby. Claire laughed softly. That sounds suspiciously like another job offer. Ethan raised both hands lightly in surrender. Consider it an open invitation rather than an offer. Claire studied him again, noticing the way he spoke without arrogance, something she rarely saw in people with his level of influence. You know, she said thoughtfully, if nothing else comes from this conversation, I am glad we met. Ethan smiled. I was just about to say the same thing. Claire stood slowly from her chair and picked up her coat. I should probably get some more sleep before tonight's shift. Ethan stood as well. Another long evening at the restaurant. Claire nodded. The city never runs out of stories. Ethan looked at her with quiet respect. And you never run out of ways to notice them. Claire slipped her coat over her shoulders and paused for a moment before turning toward the cafe door. Be careful tonight, Ethan said gently. Claire glanced back with a playful smile. I always am. Then she stepped outside into the bright Manhattan sunlight, leaving Ethan Whitmore standing beside the small cafe table, realizing that something about Claire Holloway had quietly changed the way he looked at the entire world around him. That evening the lights of Alder and Finch glowed warmly against the dark Manhattan street, as Claire Holloway tied the strings of her apron behind her back and stepped onto the restaurant floor for another shift. The rhythm of the dining room had already begun building. Glasses clinked softly. Conversations blended into a steady hum. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen while the piano player tested a few quiet notes near the bar. To anyone watching, Claire looked exactly as she had every other night for the past 3 years. Calm, observant, moving between tables with quiet confidence. Yet something inside her felt slightly different. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a subtle awareness that the world might be a little larger than it had seemed yesterday morning. Lily appeared beside her carrying a tray of menus and a bright smile. Guess what? Lily whispered. Claire raised an eyebrow. You won the lottery. Lily laughed. Not quite. But table 12 asked specifically for you. Claire glanced toward the front of the dining room where the hostess was guiding new guests to their seats. That happens sometimes, she said calmly. Lily shook her head. Not like this. Claire looked again toward the table. And then she saw him. Ethan Whitmore sat at table 12 wearing a dark jacket and a relaxed expression that suggested he was not there for a business meeting. For a moment Claire simply stood still, surprised by the quiet confidence of the gesture. He had come back. Lily followed her gaze, and her eyes widened slightly. Is that the guy from last night? Claire nodded slowly. Lily leaned closer with an excited whisper. The billionaire coffee date guy? Claire tried not to smile too obviously. Lower your voice. Lily grinned and hurried away to deliver menus at another table, leaving Claire standing near the service station with a small realization settling into place. Ethan Whitmore had returned to the restaurant not as a guest surrounded by executives, but as a single customer sitting quietly near the window. Claire picked up a water pitcher and walked toward the table with the same steady pace she used every night. Ethan looked up as she approached. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Claire set the water glass gently in front of him. "Good evening," she said politely. Ethan smiled in a way that looked far less formal than the night before. "Good evening, Claire." Claire tilted her head slightly. "I thought billionaires usually ate somewhere quieter on weeknights." Ethan shrugged lightly. "I discovered a restaurant yesterday where the service is exceptional." Claire raised an eyebrow with playful skepticism. "That sounds like a carefully constructed compliment." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Perhaps." Claire poured water into his glass and set the pitcher down. "Are you meeting someone tonight?" Ethan shook his head. "Actually, yes." Claire glanced around the dining room briefly before looking back at him. "Where are they?" Ethan met her eyes calmly. "Standing in front of me." Claire blinked once, surprised despite herself. Ethan continued gently. "I realized something after you left the cafe this morning." Claire folded her arms loosely as she listened. Ethan gestured toward the busy dining room around them. "You said the city never runs out of stories." Claire nodded. "It does not." Ethan smiled. "Then I thought perhaps I should stop rushing through the city and start paying attention to the people who notice those stories." Claire studied his expression carefully, searching for the same confidence she had seen during the meeting the night before. It was still there, but it was quieter now, more genuine. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" she asked. Ethan rested his hands on the table. "By coming back here occasionally and asking the most observant waitress in Manhattan what she has noticed lately." Claire laughed softly, the sound blending with the music drifting through the restaurant. "That sounds suspiciously like an excuse for dinner." Ethan did not deny it. "It might be." Claire looked around the dining room again, noticing the comfortable rhythm of the restaurant that had shaped her life for so long. Then she looked back at Ethan Whitmore, the man who had quietly stepped into that rhythm without trying to change it. "All right," she said after a moment. "But I should warn you about something." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What is that?" Claire smiled with calm confidence. "If you keep coming back here, people might start thinking you like the waitress." Ethan Whitmore smiled in return. "Claire," he said softly, "I am starting to think that might be exactly the problem." Claire felt warmth rise to her cheeks despite her usual composure. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet evening dance of plates and conversation. Another table called for water. The piano shifted into a slower melody. Life moved forward as it always did in Manhattan. Yet as Claire picked up the water pitcher again, and Ethan watched her walk toward the next table, both of them understood something that had begun with a silent message beneath a restaurant table and had grown into something neither of them expected. Sometimes the most important connections do not begin with grand plans or dramatic promises. Sometimes they begin quietly with two people who simply notice each other in a crowded room and decide, without saying it out loud, that the story between them is worth continuing. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to support the channel. Please like the video, share it with someone who loves meaningful stories, and subscribe to Love After Everything channel so you never miss our next cinematic journey. Your support helps us continue creating powerful human stories about dignity, courage, and unexpected connections. Thank you for watching and being part of this growing community.